Good evening, everyone. I'm Tish Calamer, Community Engagement Manager at the Gale Borden Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you all this evening. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Nancy Lamaya, who will then have more information about our wonderful guest speaker and the program tonight.
Thanks, Tish, and good evening. Welcome to the third session of our Start in Your Yard series, Under Our Feet. A special welcome to our presenter, Emma Leavens, and thank you to the Morton Arboretum for sharing her with us. Thank you too to the Gale Borden Library for hosting our series again this year. And thanks to the Elgin Sustainability Commission for sponsoring this event in partnership with our Greater Kane County Wild Ones chapter. And welcome to all of you who have attended the first two sessions in our series. And welcome to those of you who waited for the session with drama. We're glad you're here to hear about what's going on beneath our feet. Just a couple of announcements. If you're looking for the handout for the series, you'll find a link to it in your Zoom reminder email and also on startinyouryard.com. And if you're new to native gardening, you can email Sadia Ahmed to request a coupon to redeem at our Wild Ones public native plant sale on Saturday, May 13th. Make a note, at Gray Willows Farm in Campton Township. All these details are in the chat. Our wrap-up session of Under Our Feet is next month, April 18th, a panel discussion translating the information from these presentations into practice for us at home. And in case you missed a session, the videos are on startinyouryard.com. Click the Community Read tab. And March 27th, we're starting up our Monday night roundtables, unstructured conversations full of whatever's on people's minds that night. And finally, Thursday, March 30th is our monthly Wild Ones meeting in person and on Zoom with Dan Williams talking about the top 10 things new native plant gardeners need to know. Details for all of these events will be in our newsletter, and they're at startinyouryard.com. And now let me turn the meeting over to Jean Muntz, my Wild Ones Start in Your Yard collaborator, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, soil is the Earth's skin, and it's what grounds us. And if you're beginning to realize that after two of our four-part series, that what lies beneath our feet is a true scientific frontier that deserves our understanding and respect, we think tonight's speaker will expand that viewpoint of soil as a living community. Emma Leavens cares for the Ware Field Experimental Prairie and supports research on interactions between plants, soils, and microbes at the Morton Arboretum. She's keen on understanding how soil organisms inform plant community assembly and how to apply science to better conserve and restore our natural ecosystems. She has a master's degree in plant biology and conservation from Northwestern University and an ever-expanding admiration for organisms and their interactions with each other. We heard about Emma's work when planning this series with Mark Bramstead, last month's speaker. We met Emma when she was a featured speaker at the 2022 annual conference hosted by the Wild Ones Lake to Prairie chapter. And more recently, she participated in the Wild Things Conference held in Rosemont in February. We think Emma Leavens is the right person to speak about drama beneath our feet, life in the soil.
Thank you so much. That's such a warm introduction. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak and for organizing this. I'm really excited that people are excited about soil and want to hear about it and talk about it. So in the spirit of that, I'll just share my screen. And can you all see that now?
Yes, I see it.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I am going to talk about drama beneath our feet. I'm going to talk about soil organisms and soil organic matter. So I really appreciate the way that Jean introduced that as soil being a scientific frontier, especially before what I'm about to share with you, because I am going to share sort of about organic matter, but then also soil organisms. And we have so much to learn about soil organisms. Like, we as a species are just beginning to understand all of the species that live in the soil. And so I think it being a real frontier is a really accurate characterization. So just to give you a quick overview here, let's see if I can, yes, okay. So a quick overview of what I'm going to go over. I'm going to talk a little bit about what organic matter is, essentially, and then why it's so important, why it matters so much for soil, why it helps improve soil, and why most of us want it for our various purposes with soil. And then I'm going to talk about the soil organisms, starting with the biggest and moving to the smallest. And I'm actually going to spend the most time talking about the smallest organisms, because although they are the smallest, they make a huge, huge impact on our soils and our ecosystems in totality. So after that, I'm going to talk very briefly about Necromass, so just a very quick note on Necromass and what that is. And then lastly, how to foster soil diversity in your yard, which will be very quick because I know the last session in this series is going to talk more in depth about how to actually apply soil knowledge in the ways that you garden and the ways you take care of soil. So what is organic matter? Organic matter is essentially just material that is living or used to be living. I really like this picture for this because this picture sort of looks like nothing and yet also has so much going on once you learn about what actually is happening in organic matter. But organic matter is just material that is living or used to be living. So that can include plant litter, so your leaves in the yard, twigs, dead organisms, dead animals, and then dead roots or living roots, fungi, bacteria, something called Actinomycdes, which might be a less familiar term, which I'll talk about a little bit. Nematodes, which are really small worms, mites, springtails, ants, and a whole lot more. This list would be really long, would sort of take all night if I went through all of the things that make this up, but this is just a sampling of the organisms that make up the sort of living and dead material of organic matter. So organic matter makes up just about 5% of your soil. So in a healthy soil that isn't too compacted, about half of it is going to be the mineral material that is sort of like the broken down parent material of your soil, which you can't really change much. Then another half of it is going to be air and water. Of course, that's going to vary in proportion depending on, the given day and what's going on. But let's see. So that other half of air and water is all dependent on there being pore space in the soil. So there has to be space in between all of that mineral material for air and water to move through. And then lastly is the organic matter. So organic matter only makes up about 5%, and it sounds small, but it is so significant. So I recently have started thinking about organic matter a lot, like people talk about our microbiomes and our digestive systems. So if you follow some of these stories, like we're learning more and more about human health and how dependent it is on having a whole wide array of diversity of organisms and primarily bacteria of different kinds living in our digestive systems. And without those, even though we have sort of the mechanics of a digestive system, not much happens. So nutrients don't get extracted from food well, nutrients don't get absorbed, things don't get broken down properly. Having that biodiversity in our digestive systems is really essential to having a full healthy body. And I think organic matter is very much that for the soil body. So without organic matter, there isn't really going to be life in the soil. So what does it actually do for soil? A few things. I'm going to break this down into sort of 3 categories. One is physical benefits. So organic matter improves soil texture for most purposes. Most of those purposes are things that humans want to do with soil. So when we talk about soil health or talk about soil quality, we're primarily talking about it in reference to a specific use that humans have for soils. Most uses that humans have for soils are going to be improved. They're going to be better off with organic matter in it because it's going to help give more pore space. It's going to help hold water. So that's the next thing, is that organic matter improves water holding capacity. If you imagine a pile of leaves that you raked up and then left for a couple of weeks, when you go back, you realize that it's quite a bit heavier than it probably was on that first day, because it actually just retains water really well. So that's exactly what's happening with organic matter in the soil. It's just happening more kind of distributed throughout the soil. That water also makes the soil hospitable to billions of organisms, which are the ones we're going to talk about. So it makes that environment of the soil able to support lots of organisms. It provides the water, and then it also is going to have that other pore space where there's going to be air, so organisms can be healthy. And then lastly, for the physical benefits, organic matter also helps reduce runoff and supports aggregate stability. So these are two ways in which it can help support overall stability and cohesion among the soil body. Next is the chemical benefits. So organic matter helps soils store and also provide nutrients. So all of these nutrients here that are important to plant life, that are also important to all of the microorganisms and macroorganisms that are living in soils. Organic matter helps provide a lot of those nutrients, and then also can help actually store them even long term through some of the processes we'll talk about a little bit more once I get into the organisms. And then it also helps buffer soils from really severe or really rapid shifts in pH. So we know that most plants, most organisms at large, have a pH range in which they do really well. And if that pH range shifts quickly or shifts dramatically, the health and probably even the life of that organism might be impacted negatively. And so having more organic matter helps kind of buffer that a little bit and limits the likelihood of that happening. Lastly, for biological benefits, so organic matter feeds the soil organisms, because organic matter is the carbon that provides energy to the whole array of diversity of life that lives in the soil. One thing about this last one is I sometimes think it's a little bit circular, because organic matter both feeds soil organisms and in many cases is soil organisms. So there's this sort of feedback that's happening there where you provide organic matter to a soil and you're able to feed what's there, and then that will in turn kind of provide the next generation. So this is a graphic that you may have some familiar with. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations created this a little while back to kind of help people learn that soils host a quarter of our planet's biodiversity. I actually suspect that this is an underestimate. I don't have data to show you that tonight, but we don't know all of the organisms that live in soil. We don't know all of the organisms that don't live in soil, but we definitely don't know the full array of diversity that lives in soil. So I think that I suspect this is a fairly conservative estimate, just to give you a sense of how big a deal soil organisms are. So this is just a sampling of those organisms, and I'll stress a sampling. This is just one kind of version of a soil food web. So starting with the bottom, we have the organic matter. They're broken down like leaves and stems, roots, dead plants, dead organisms. And from there, there are a wide array of organisms that are going to feed off of that. There's going to be bacteria, fungi, there's that Actinomycds, which I'll talk about, and then some of the more familiar things, snails, earthworms, that sort of stuff. And then that kind of goes on to the next organism and the next organism in a food chain. This might be a little bit misleading, because some of that big stuff is often going to be broken down first by the larger organisms like those ground beetles and the centipedes and things like that, or ants. So I'm going to start here with some of the bigger organisms. So this group is considered soil organisms that are larger than 2 millimeters. So ants, termites, earthworms, dung beetles, these are organisms that you're probably somewhat familiar with because you can see them. And these are crucially important to cycling organic matter into the soil. So they break down large material into smaller material. So a dung beetle can actually move a whole like bison patty into the soil overnight. So if you think about dung beetles doing that every night, that's so much material that's getting churned into the soil. So that first step of getting some of this material from, say, the soil surface, then integrated through the soil horizons is really important. And they mix it across these layers. So this creates kind of a churning effect. And through their movements through the soil, they create pore space for air and water. And so they help keep that proportion that we saw earlier kind of in check. It keeps that air space, keeps that water space available. Next size class of organisms are a little bit smaller. These are springtails or mites, which you might have seen even on houseplants and things. And they obviously are harder to find cute cartoons of. But these are going to perform a lot of the same services that macrofauna do, but just on a smaller scale. The one exception is they don't really typically contribute a ton to creating pore space in the soil because they just don't have the size to do it. But they do help move those nutrients around. So if you imagine our macrofauna moving, a whole dung patty around, these smaller organisms are going to move smaller pieces at a smaller scale. And so that's churning this material in at an even finer scale. And they're also going to be, eating, they're going to be excreting things, and that helps make whatever nutrients are in the things that they eat, it's helping make them available to other organisms and also to plants. And then this is the group that I'm going to spend the most time talking about, are the microorganisms. So I've shared this here as microfauna, flora, and fungi because I had an advisor who advocated for using the term fungi because we often refer to flora and fauna. And when we do so, we leave out a really important group of organisms. So I'm going to use fungi here to kind of honor that. So this is another portion of that same graphic from FAO that I showed earlier. So this is sharing that there are more organisms in 1 tablespoon of healthy soil than there are people on Earth, which is pretty astounding. And again, we don't even know the full array of life that's happening in the soil yet, but we've learned enough to know that it's a whole lot. There's a whole lot going on in there. And if you think about all of these people on the Earth, that's 1 species, whereas a tablespoon of healthy soil can have up to 50,000 species. So 50,000 species, we don't even know what all of those are, what all of those are doing, but if they're there, then they've found a niche. So they've found a function, they've found a use. And so that means that there's quite a diversity of ways of life and lifestyles among these organisms also, which I find like pretty inspiring, pretty astounding. So let's see, I'm going to start with talking about bacteria. So bacteria is pervasive in the soil. There's a ton of bacteria doing great work in the soil. I know that in about an acre of soil, there's roughly like 2 cows worth of biomass. So if you can imagine the biomass of 2 cows, and then sort of disperse it in small bacterial sized bits, that's about how much biomass of bacteria there is in every acre. So there's quite a lot of sort of material there. And bacteria tend to be most active around what's called the rhizosphere. So in this graphic, in the center circle, that what's the sort of brown, light brown portion that's protruding is a graphic of a root. And what this is showing is that right around the root is where bacteria are most active. The area right around, immediately within the few millimeters around the root surface, is called the rhizosphere. And that's where the root is going to be exuding out starches and proteins and various chemical signals, and the microbes are really attracted to that. It's food and it's stimuli, and so that zone is where a lot of the activity of bacteria is happening. It is important to note that there are a lot of bacteria that live in the bulks, what's called the bulk soil, so the area kind of away from roots, but most activity is happening right up next to the roots. So these guys also are going to be consuming organic matter, which means they're also going to be excreting things. So they're going to be breaking things down and turning things into forms that are more accessible either to other plants or to other organisms. And then they also kind of exude excretions that help soils aggregate. So I think I actually saw a question already about aggregate stability. So soil aggregation is where clumps of soil kind of stick to each other, and they stick to each other with kind of gooey substances that soil organisms exude. So that gooey substance can come from plants, it can come from bacteria, it can come from fungi, it can come from anywhere, but it helps soil stick together. And when you help soil stick together, it improves your soil texture, but it also helps lock certain nutrients and carbon into those little balls, those little aggregates, and that helps with long-term health and stability of the ecosystem. Bacteria also help plants kind of defend themselves against pathogenic organisms, either through providing more health to the plant or more directly by fending off pathogens. So we often think of bacteria in sort of negative context, or it's given kind of a bad reputation, but bacteria is hugely important to health for us and for plants. And a huge majority of antibiotics that we have, and also like healthy biotics that we have, come from soil. It's all living out there. And then bacteria also fixes nitrogen through a symbiosis. So this image is the root of what is likely a legume, so any plant in the bean family. And those nodules that you're seeing are little zones where a bacteria has formed a relationship with this plant and developed a process where they are able to take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a form that is useful for the plants. And this is enormously important in natural ecosystems for kind of providing nitrogen and keeping nitrogen moving, keeping nitrogen available to the next round of plants. It's also enormously important in agricultural settings. And this mechanism, this relationship between bacteria and plants has become something that humans also really rely heavily on. You can also see that it's kind of a reddish tinge. If you've ever had like Beyond Meat and it has that like reddish thing, that comes from nodules kind of like this. That's where that color is coming from. So bacteria is really important for getting these nutrients cycling and moving things around in this system. Okay, I'm going to move to another group. So Actinomyctes, I promised I would talk about Actinomyctes. Actinomyctes are prokaryotic organisms. So they are technically bacteria, but they look a lot like fungi. At some point, they were categorized as being fungi, and then they were recategorized as bacteria, and then now they're sort of this subset within bacteria. Its particular classification isn't important. What is really important is that Actinomyctes are really good at breaking down complex compounds from plants, animals, and fungi. So fungi are really good at breaking things down. We know that they are good at breaking down a lot of chemicals in wood that are fairly complex. Actinomyctes is also especially good at that. They also are good at breaking down fungi. So the sort of trend in all of this is that everyone who is living in the soil is breaking down something and making it available for somebody else. And this cycle is continuing. Without all of those players, though, there's going to be things that can't be broken down, which means there isn't opportunity for that next wave of organisms to live. So Actinomyctes are really important because they help break down some of this really complex stuff. They also do in some cases, support nitrogen fixation in nodules, just like we saw in the bacteria on the last slide. Actinomyctes sometimes participate in this as well. They also produce this chemical geosmin, I'm actually not sure how to say it, but this chemical is, whenever you go outside after it rains and you can smell that it rained, it like has that rain smell, that is produced by Actinomycdes. So that should give you a sense of just how pervasive Actinomycdes are. They're all over the place to the extent that when it rains, you can smell them. And that's our like association, our like sensory association with rain. So these are all over and they're really important. So, okay, next group. So mycorrhizal fungi, another really important group of soil organisms. And I'm a little biased. These are the ones that I've studied the most and the ones I frankly know the most about. So I'm going to talk about them a little bit more extensively than I've talked about some of the other groups. So this image is showing just grass that was grown with mycorrhizal fungi and without mycorrhizal fungi. And you can see that on the left, that grass is a little bit more robust. You can tell it's a bit healthier. There's simply more of it. You can also see that that soil is really, really full and really filled. And then on the right, there's a little bit less grass. It doesn't look quite as robust. And you can see the roots of that grass, but then you can also see parts of the soil that are not inhabited by those roots. On the picture on the left with mycorrhizal fungi, not all of that white material is roots. A good portion of that is fungi. And that's because this mycorrhizal fungi actually acts as like kind of an extension of the root system. So this is something that I think has become more widely known and understood more recently, is just that mycorrhizal fungi exists and how important it is. And it kind of can't be overstated, sort of how important it is for most plants. So I'm going to go into this a little bit further and talk about some of the different groups of mycorrhizal fungi that exist. So overall, mycorrhizal fungi make up about half the living portion of soil. That's actually a note that Merlin Sheldrake made in Entangled Life, which I know is one of the books recommended in this series, and it's a really worthwhile read. He notes that somewhere between 30 and 50% of the living portion of soil is mycorrhizal fungi. I suspect we don't have an exact number, and I suspect it varies from system to system, but this is just to say a very large portion of what lives in the soil is mycorrhizal fungi, even though you're not likely to see it. So mycorrhizae attach themselves to typically the roots of plants, and they take carbon from it. So plants are photosynthesizing, producing that photosynthate, producing that carbon, and then fungi are coming along and taking it. But in exchange, they access and transport nutrients from beyond the root zone. So whatever area the roots of that plant extend to, the mycorrhizae is going to extend much further. And mycorrhizae are really good at going out into soil and finding nutrients, accessing nutrients, making them available, and then carrying them back to the plants. They're especially good at doing this with phosphorus, which is important because phosphorus is essential to plants producing fruits and seeds. So most plants don't reproduce well without having these associations. Some won't really at all, some can, but it won't be as viable or won't be as robust or won't be as numerous. That phosphorus access is really important, along with many other things, but the phosphorus is one that I know a lot of people have focused on because it's so crucial for the plants. And then mycorrhizal fungi also produce sticky exudates. So they also excrete various carbon molecules and various proteins, sugars, things like that, that help soil particles bind together into those aggregates, like I said. So all of these organisms are eating and exuding various substances, and that's all going to feed someone or help the soil bind together, providing a healthier context in which for these organisms to live. So I just wanted to share this to kind of show how important mycorrhizal fungi are to plants. So this is a breakdown of what portion of plant species rely on different types of mycorrhizae. So in the upper left, in the light blue, is sort of a sliver of 8%, indicating 8% of plant species on the planet are non-mycorrhizal. Only 8% of plants don't associate with mycorrhizal fungi. And then going counterclockwise to the orchids, there are about 10% of plant species that associate with orchid mycorrhizae, which I'll describe in a moment. As you might guess, those are orchids. Those are largely orchids that are associating with orchid mycorrhizal fungi. And then continuing further into that sliver of green are the ectomycorrhizal fungi, which only about 2% of plants associate with, but this is likely to be the type of mycorrhizae you're most familiar with if you're not sort of deep into the world of mycorrhizae. And that's for two reasons. One is that these typically are the mycorrhizae that woody species associate with. So a lot of trees associate with ectomycorrhizal fungi. The oaks in our area associate with ectomycorrhizal fungi. The other thing about them is that these ones are the ones that produce what are called fruiting bodies. So that's just meaning they produce mushrooms. Ectomycorrhizal fungi typically produce mushrooms. So if you go out into an area, in a natural area, and you see a mushroom and it's not on a log, kind of clearly decomposing something that's dead, and it's just sticking up out of the ground, it's probably ectomycorrhizal. Then moving further is this little sliver of red, which is the ericoid mycorrhizae. And those associate only with a family of plants called Ericaceae. At some point in their evolution, this group of fungi and that group of plants just like made a deal and decided to co-evolve, and they kind of specialized to each other. And then 72% of plant species associate with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So a majority of plants on the planet associate with this particular type. And then up in the top is that orange piece, which says AMNM, and that just stands for arbuscular mycorrhizal or non-mycorrhizal. So that's 7% of plant species. You can kind of take or leave this association. They can survive without them, but sometimes they do associate with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi anyway, just for a little added benefit. So this is partly, I think, really interesting to know that there are sort of these different groups, but partly I wanted to just show how important this is to plant life. So we talk about how these fungi take carbon from the plants, but the deal is clearly pretty good because most plants are buying into that. So the orchid mycorrhizal fungi, I wanted to talk about the sort of how they are essential to the life cycle of orchids a little bit. So starting in the middle with that purple orchid graphic, and then going to the top, you see a dust seed. So a lot of seeds have what is called an endosperm. They have kind of material in them that gets converted into the first leaves of the plant. So if you think about a bean, all of that like material in the bean that makes it such a good source of food for us, all of that gets turned into energy to make the first leaves of that bean plant if you plant it. And then those leaves can photosynthesize, and then the plant has energy to produce a stem and more leaves and so on. Orchids don't do that. Orchids just produce these really tiny dust seeds. You can barely see one individual seed. Then it has no endosperm. It has no energy with which to get started. So it partners with mycorrhizal fungus. So moving clockwise, it partners with a fungus, and that fungus provides the energy that that dust seed needs to turn into a baby plant. In this case, it's just called the protocorum. This is just saying that it's sort of initial stage of a plant, and it's entirely dependent on that fungus for life. And then there are two kind of ways this can progress. I'm going to go to the center. I'm going to go back to the purple orchid in the center first. One way is that protocorum grows some leaves, grows a stem, grows into an orchid as we typically think of orchids. And at that stage, it is able to photosynthesize, it can produce its own energy, and so it's not reliant on the mycorrhizal fungus. So at that point, it sometimes stops associating with the fungus, or it hangs on and kind of takes a little bit from the fungus and maybe gives a little bit to the fungus, but it's not completely reliant on it until it produces seed, and then it needs that fungus again for the next seed to grow. The other route is going kind of the long way. What in this graphic is the long way, which is to the achlorophyllous orchid adult, the orchid that doesn't have any color in it. Because some orchids don't ever produce leaves that photosynthesize. They won't photosynthesize, so they won't create their own energy, which means they're entirely dependent on the mycorrhizal fungus for the entirety of its life cycle. It can't germinate without them. It can't produce seed without them. Either way, orchids are dependent on mycorrhizal fungus and for their life to continue. I also want to note here, orchids are the second most, but it's a very close race, second most diverse plant species, plant families in the plant world. So this is a group of plants that are entirely dependent on mycorrhizal fungus, and they're wildly diverse, which means this is a wildly successful way to go about life, which I think is a real testament to just how important and impactful mycorrhizal fungus can be. Moving to another group of organisms. So this is the ectomycorrhizal fungi, which you probably already know it's the ectomycorrhizal fungi, even if I hadn't labeled it, for two reasons. One, it's attached to clearly a woody species here, a woody plant. And two, it has fruiting bodies. There are mushrooms there. And those mushrooms send out hyphy, which are just thread-like filaments that attach to the roots of that plant. And this is how they do that. So this is a graphic of a cross section of a root. So if you imagine taking a root, cutting it open, and then looking sort of down the root, this is looking at half of that root. And in the center are the colored, the blue, green, and pink colored kind of cells there. And that's just indicating that's where the vascular tissue of the plant is. But what is more important for understanding how this mycorrhizae is working is looking at the orange, which are the plant cells of the root. And then all this hyphy, which looks like kind of Twizzlers in this case, all of that red, those red strings are representing the hyphy of the ectomycorrhizal fungi. And ectomycorrhizal fungi do this. They create this like net around the tip of the root. And so you can imagine that if that root exudes carbon, that hyphy is there and ready to absorb it. And also you can imagine that if that hyphy has phosphorus or any other nutrients to provide to the root, they can exude them right there and that root is ready to take it up. There are some hyphae that go into the root a little bit, but they don't actually penetrate the cells. So you can see that all of those hyphae are sort of staying between the cells. The reason that's important is because it's in contrast to endomycorrhizal fungi. I know that endomycorrhizae is a new term that I haven't introduced yet, so just bear with me for a second and I'll explain kind of what that is in just a moment. On the left side, you see hyphae again, but you don't see that net. You don't see this like kind of web of hyphae that's just wrapping around that root. Instead, you see hyphae that have gone into the root and they've gone into the actual cells of the root. And so the endomycorrhizae, endo being in, ecto being out, endo actually kind of invade or colonize. It depends kind of your terminology of choice, but they colonize these cells within the root. And that's really where the action is for these endomycorrhizae. So the endomycorrhizal fungi are kind of most of the other fungi. Ectomycorrhizae are the ones that stay on the outside. Most of the other types go on the inside. But the one that I'm going to talk about most is the arbuscule mycorrhizal fungi, these guys. So I'm going to refer to it as AMF from here on out just to save myself a little bit of breath. So this image is a root looking at it sideways. So if you can kind of ignore the blue for just a moment and look at just the gray lines, there's sort of that tube, and that is a root. That's just the length of a root. And then look a little more closely at that gray and you'll see those cells within the root. So you'll see kind of a kind of brick design in gray. Okay, so that is all the root and the root cells. and then kind of zoom back out and look at the blue. And there are a few different organs of AMF that we're looking at here. So this is the hyphy. That's that stringy material, what was the Twizzlers in the last one. That's the part of the organism that is kind of exploratory. It's going out, it's looking around, it might be searching for phosphorus, it might be searching for a root. It's kind of the crew that's going to look out and seek. This is what's called the vesicle, which is a sort of sack of fats that the fungi has kind of put in storage in case there's a rainy day, in case it's invested heavily into this root, which it looks like it has, and that root is no longer viable and it doesn't yet have another host, then it has a little bit of material that it can pull from. Some of these darker, really big round circles are probably spores also. So there's an extra kind of bonus organ in here. And then the last one I want to point out is an arborbuscule. So you can see a lot of like splotchy patches of blue, and those actually aren't ones that are out of focus. That actually is just sort of what the structure will look like. And these are the organs that this group of fungi are named after. So arbuscules are where all of the exchange happens between this fungus and this plant. And they're actually named for looking like trees. So arbor is sort of the root word, arboretum, and so arbuscule actually is also a small shrub. So there's sort of a suite of words that have that arbor sound in it that all mean trees or tree-like, and arbuscule is one of those. So this is a close-up of an arbuscule, which is where the hyphy has invaded a single cell of a root, and then it's kind of filled it out. So what you're seeing as what looks like sort of the trunk, if you will, of this tree is that larger hyphy that we saw more clearly in the last slide. That was the exploratory stuff. And then once it got to where it wanted to be, once it got to an individual cell of this root, then it produced all of this really, really fine hyphy, which is sort of what makes up the leaves of this tree, so to speak. And that's where all of the exchange is happening. Those tips are where there's carbon coming in, nutrients going out. So that's kind of the like fungi as I'll discuss it. And then I'm going to talk about just another group of organisms really quickly, which are the nematodes. So nematodes you've probably heard about, or you may have heard about. I think they're also kind of becoming better understood, a little bit better known. They are likely to be the most abundant animal on the planet. I say likely because we just don't know what we don't know, but we do know there are a whole lot of nematodes. In every tablespoon of soil, there are tons of these little guys. And nematodes are also important to this soil food web and the kind of processing of organic matter, because they eat fungi, they eat bacteria, they eat other nematodes, they eat plant parts, and all of this is contributing to that cycling. Again, everyone is sort of eating and being eaten and excreting along the way, and all of this is maintaining nutrient availability for sort of the next wave. It's this constant cycling that's happening, and these are one component of that. Nematodes are also really sort of bizarre. Nematodes can hunt. They've been known to sort of create little traps where if hyphae of fungi come through, they're sort of ready to like absorb it. But there has also been research on like how oyster mushrooms will sometimes eat nematodes. And by eat, I mean they exude material that kind of like dissolves nematodes. And then once that happens, the fungi absorb it. So these kind of cycles of the food web don't always go in the direction you might think. And perhaps more than anything, they're just a lot more dynamic than I think we even know. All of these organisms are trying to make a living and they're doing their best. And there's some pretty steep competition going on in here. Most antibiotics, if not all antibiotics that we use, also come from soil organisms. So you can imagine with all of the bacteria that I talked about earlier, that it might help some organisms to kind of fend those off. And so this environment produces a lot of competitive strategies. these nematodes also just make nutrients available. I think I've sort of covered that, but by contributing to the cycling, they're doing that. They regulate populations of organisms they eat. That's true of a lot of these organisms. I think it's especially true of nematodes, though, because they are so abundant that I think they're actually really keeping quite a lot of organisms in check a lot of the time. And then, of course, they're providing food to the organisms that eat them. They eat and are eaten. Okay, so you might have to bear with me for this one a little bit. I kind of couldn't help myself. I really wanted to show you this figure from a paper. I've avoided scientific papers for the most part, but this one I really wanted to show. You can honestly ignore most of what's going on in this figure. You can ignore the images around the roots. You can ignore the blue lettering and all of the arrows. What I wanted to show you is that necromass is really important. Necromass is just dead life. So this is a paper about microbial necromass. So microbes that had died and how many dead microbes there are in the soil and why that is important. So looking at, if we just take a look at cropland here. So if we look at cropland and look straight below that and look into the brown circle, the first thing it says is SOC. That stands for soil organic carbon. So this is carbon that is stored in a fairly stable form in the soil. And just below where it says SOC in big, it says SOC equals 51%. What that is saying is that 51% of the carbon stored in the soil in a cropland is actually dead microbes. And then further below that in the smaller circle is just showing you that most of that is from fungi. If we look at grasslands and look down at the soil organic carbon and the total content, says soil organic carbon equals 47%. So 47% of the carbon stored in this system in the soil is dead microbes. And then looking at the forest, again, just looking down into that brown circle, 35%. So pardon the sort of overly complicated graphic for this, but I really wanted to share the point that even when organisms in this system are dead, they are really, really important. They are actually storing a huge portion of the carbon that's in our soils. So that should really say something about how much is going on in soil beyond the plant life, beyond even like individual types of organisms. They just make up a huge mass and they make up a huge portion of carbon that has become stable in the soil. So if you want to store carbon in your soil, you have to bring microbes to it and let those microbes die, let those microbes have their life cycle and their death cycle to actually build up this storage of carbon, soil organic carbon. So with that, how to actually foster this in your yard, plant diversity. So I actually didn't mean this to have two meanings, but it fits in both ways. So planting diversity and planting a diversity of plants is going to provide some level of like diversity in your soil organisms, which is going to mean there's going to be fungi that's going to come along. There's going to be the bacteria, Actinomycdes, and all of that is going to live and then it's going to die. And that cycle will continue and build up some of that carbon, as well as building pore space into your soil and making it a healthier space for the plants and also all of these other organisms. Also, if you can just leave it alone once you plant that diversity, all the better. Because especially for fungi, if we break up the soil, we're breaking up all of those tiny threads of fungi that have grown through the soil body. And so if we break those, they have to start all over again. So planting diversity and then leaving it alone is really, really helpful to actually building the soil web in like a yard or in a field or wherever it is that you might get the opportunity to take care of plants and soil. So the other thing about this is that sometimes soils have been really degraded or really compacted, and that can be a hard starting point for this. But if you have the opportunity to add compost, that means you're supplementing your soil. So remember, the organic matter is just 5% of the soil. So if you can help supplement that, if you can help get this cycle going, that's going to make a huge difference. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions about any of this. I think there may already be some questions.
Yes, there are. I believe that you addressed the aggregate stability. Okay. And then somebody's asking, is this PowerPoint available for our use to teach others? And I did respond to this person saying that the video would be available, and I don't know how you would feel about your PowerPoint being available.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. Yeah, I think that we can make that available. Yeah, so if maybe I'll check with you, Nancy, afterwards if there's a way that would be easy to do that, but I'm happy to share it.
Oh, good.
I'm happy
Well,
to share
thank
any
you.
notes that would be helpful also.
Excellent, excellent. Karen asks whether mycorrhizal fungi in purchased potting soils is still alive and viable.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there probably is some, and it probably is alive, and there probably is some that's viable. One thing to note about that, though, is that there are sort of weedy species of mycorrhizal fungi. So sometimes in like commercial inoculants of mycorrhizae or in soil that claims to provide mycorrhizae, what you might be getting are species of probably AMF that have been cultivated or that were just really easy to capture. And those often are not the ones that are going to provide the sort of maximum benefit and like nuance to this cycle. So that is to say, you probably are getting some. It may not be the stuff that you want, though. And so if you're looking to foster a better diversity or more helpful diversity, then kind of getting into composting or going, planting things into natural soils is going to probably be the most helpful.
Is it, does it degrade the soil to have these, you call them weedy species of mycorrhizal?
It doesn't really degrade them that I'm aware of, but what it can do is make it harder for other mycorrhizae to get going. And in some cases, there's been some research on how some of the kind of quote unquote weedy species are actually not really helping those plants. Because if you imagine a weedy species might be outcompeted in a natural system, but might do really well in, a potted system, but that might not be the mycorrhizae that your native plant really wants, or your non-native plant really wants. So having you want a healthy partnership, but kind of collaborative partnership there. And sometimes those weedy species are not the ones that are most helpful.
Interesting. Wow. If someone has to use Roundup to control invasive plants, how does Roundup affect the soil organisms?
Yeah, good question. So there actually is some research coming out now. I do know a friend who has looked into this actually and found that it didn't have a huge effect on the soil organisms. It did affect the plants, and of course it probably cut off a carbon source. But the nice thing about that is that your native plants are probably going to feed your native soil organisms a lot better than the invasive species was. So the payoff is going to be worth it. But also if you can minimize just getting the herbicide on the soil directly, it's likely to be just fine. And even if it does get on the soil, there's so much life kind of in the layers below it or next to it that it's probably likely to recover pretty quickly.
And when you said that does this have to do with coevolution again? Okay.
Yeah. And so there are a couple of factors, like the invasives that come to mind are like garlic mustard is one that we pull. Garlic mustard isn't mycorrhizal. And so that's one of the ways it can be really detrimental to natural areas, is that it's essentially starving fungi that might otherwise be living there. And so when you get native plants returning, they have to kind of stimulate mycorrhizae again and kind of reform those connections. And so that can be quite detrimental beyond the plant community, but also the soil community. And then another is buckthorn, of course, and buckthorn messes with all kinds of things, but one of the ways it does it is it has really nitrogen-rich leaves, and those leaves fall, and they create a much faster cycle of decomposition in the soil. And so a lot of the organisms, and actually a lot of the organic matter that would have been breaking down more slowly and feeding native organisms, is eliminated really quickly. And so again, kind of starving the soil organisms that we would want to have. That might have been a long answer to what you're asking, but
Oh, but
Oh,
fascinating. I loved it. Angel asked, I've forgotten to use the name so far. Pardon me, everybody. So actinomycets are what makes that lovely petrichor smell after the rain.
yeah. So there are a couple other types of bacteria that also produce it. But my understanding is that the majority of what we smell after rain is from Actinomycetes.
Huh. And Gail asks, what kinds of organic matter work well in our clay soil? Is the premium mulch we use good to mix back into the top layer of soil each year?
Yeah, if it's really compacted, then getting some mulch in is going to help, because there's going to be some good organic matter. That the nice thing about mulch is that some of it's going to break down slowly over time. It won't be all broken down right away. And so that'll kind of create like a cycle and layers to that, like incorporation. If you can, getting organic matter in once and then leaving it is great. If you can kind of get a lot of organic matter in, churn it into the system, and then plant and then leave it, that would be better than, say, mulching every year or trying to incorporate every year. For that reason that you kind of want to like build it and then kind of let the organisms take over. And if they have enough organic matter to get going, they're likely to do that. Unless your soils are really degraded, in which case you may have to. But as soon as you can, kind of let it be, the better as far as the soil organisms are concerned.
And part of letting it be is leaving the leaves and the plant material on top of the soil.
Yeah, exactly. Because there'll be organisms that will hopefully come along and be able to like break that stuff down. And so sometimes like, it's attractive to take leaves up or something like that, but those leaves attract soil organisms that do the sort of initial churning and initial breaking down. And they do that like the dung beetles, right? Like the dung beetles are breaking up material and incorporating it into the soil. And so if we take that material off or remove it in some way, we're missing out on the benefits of that like first stage that feeds lots of later stages.
Yeah. I have to say that dung beetle example of a whole bison patty in a day. Holy cow.
It's amazing. Yeah. Dung beetles are amazing.
Wow. Let's see. Tanya asked, is it beneficial to add nematodes to our soil in addition to the ones that might already be present?
My knowledge of like nematode diversity is a little bit limited. I think it's a good question. I suspect though that it's similar to the mycorrhizae, where the nematodes that people are best able to cultivate and like provide as a product are nematodes that maybe are not the most specialized and not the most diverse. And so fostering what you have is probably going to be better than buying anything that has been like packaged into a product.
I like that expression, fostering what you have. Yeah. Gary Swick asks, how does compaction impact this community?
Yeah, so compaction is going to eliminate that pore space. So all of that room where there would otherwise be water and air, and also just opportunity for moving around. Like if you imagine the beetles that are breaking down material, if they want to like help churn it in, churn it through the different layers of the soil, and they just literally can't get in, then they can't do that. And so if the soil is really compacted, then you really have to get in and like churn it up just to create opportunity to move in. And so having that space is important. If you have somewhat compacted soil, but it is still like permeable, then you may be okay if your organisms come along and start to like churn it up for you. But if it's really compacted, yeah, you'll have to do the work.
And do you recommend a particular way if it's very compacted, a particular way of getting in there? And
yeah, there's been some work done showing that if you have, say, like a woody mulch and just a shovel, and you can kind of slowly and I mean, the reason that like I say shovel is because it's of the scale that you want, like, it won't be, you can't sort of like do it one city block at a time. You have to kind of go little by little. But if you do that, then getting kind of a shovel up and getting a shovel of organic matter in and trying to mix those together and then going little by little is going to help make sure that that material actually gets in and incorporated, and so that there aren't any like non-permeable spaces anymore.
So I think where I was really going with that was, so you would not recommend rototilling.
I don't have a lot of experience with that. So I don't know that I can recommend or not recommend. Yeah. And again, that might depend on your purposes with the soil and what you're trying to do with it. So.
Corey asks, from the slide of cropland and, and forests, where the cropland had more SOC, does that mean cropland is better at carbon drawdowns?
That's a good question. Yeah, that was something I wondered also looking at that, and makes me wonder what's going on in there. One thing that might be happening, because to me that seems really counterintuitive, what might be happening there is that croplands don't have as much nutrient cycling happening and don't have as much organic matter getting cycled. And so it may be that a lot of microorganisms died and are kind of in a like kind of steady state there. Whereas in a forest, there's a whole lot more activity going on and there's like a lot more churning. The other thing about that is that was like 51% of the soil organic carbon stored in that body of soil, which doesn't mean that the total amount of soil organic carbon in the forest may be much greater, but it's that 35% of that is the soil organic, the necromass, if that makes sense. So it doesn't mean that, I just want to make sure I say this clearly, like if there's say like 100 pounds of organic matter in each one, then that would suggest that the crop field had more, but it may be the case that the crop has 100 pounds of soil organic carbon and the forest has like 800 pounds of organic carbon, but 35% of that is soil organic carbon from necromass. So there are a few different ways to look at that. I don't think, well, we know from so much other research that, okay, thanks, Corey. We just know from so much other research that crop fields don't hold more. So I just want to be careful about that.
And Karen asks, is soil organic carbon the carbon that is originally sequestered by the plant?
Good question. Yeah, soil organic carbon is carbon that has been kind of stabilized in the soil. So that can come from a number of things. So certainly a lot of it does originate from carbon exuded from the plants, and then it's gone through this sort of soil food web and ended up in like several forms and several bodies. And so, yeah, a good portion of that is coming from the plants and then ending up in organism bodies. And then some of it is also hopefully ending up in those soil aggregates. So carbon can get just kind of like encapsulated in aggregates in soil. So it's another way that it can be kind of stabilized there.
And Tanya says, thank you, it makes sense. How or in what ways can I foster my existing nematodes?
Yeah, good question. So having a diversity of plant life is going to go a long way for that. And the reason being that if you have a diversity of plant life, then you're also providing a diversity of root structures and root exudate compositions. And all of that is going to provide like different little niches within your soil community in which these organisms could thrive. So having a diversity means that whatever your particular nematodes specialize in, you're more likely to provide that by having a diversity. And you may then like provide for those and then attract others as well.
So it's very complex down under there.
It is, yes. It's very complex and lots of drama, lots of competition going on, and some helping each other out as well. Yeah.
Well, I think that's the end of our questions, but you know, I've been reading about soil, but you make it come to life, Emma. It is really different hearing someone who really knows you talk about this in this. I just love tonight.
Thank you.
I'm going to end up a soil nerd, you know.
That's great. Well, thank you.
We thank you for just a wonderful presentation and for your work at the Arboretum, for taking all our questions. Thank you, thank you. And everybody, we're going to close out and we'll see you next month, April 18th, and before that also. So thank you again, Emma. Good
Thank you
night,
so much.
everybody.